Hi everyone, it is Miss White here again today to talk to you about Simone Weil's reading from the VCE study design. So we're looking at the needs of the soul. Most of you will be looking at this during the obligations key question in Unit 3, area of study 2. So Simone Weil is French or was French. And we pronounce her name Vay as opposed to wheel or whale, like Vay. So it's quite a short reading, so I hope you enjoy it. Most of you, it'll be related to both obligations and rights. I hope that you enjoy the um, the video and that it helps you to understand the reading better. Please sit back and enjoy while I talk through my annotations. So we are going to start from the page 117 of the VAPS unit reader, if that's the one you have. So let us begin. The notion of obligations comes before that of rights, which is subordinate and relative to the former. So she gets straight into it. This is my favorite thing about this reading, just straight in there. The whole thing she's going to argue is that obligations come before rights. A right is not effectual by itself, but only in relation to the obligation to which it corresponds, the effective exercise of a right springing not from the individual who possesses it, but from men who consider themselves as being under a certain obligation towards him. Recognition of an obligation makes it effectual. So obligations come before rights because rights are not effectual without the obligation. An obligation which goes unrecognized by anybody loses none of the full force of its existence. A right which goes unrecognized by anybody is not worth very much. So this is what she's arguing. She's going to be talking us through all of this, and that obligations come before rights because an obligation which goes unrecognized an obligation which goes unrecognized by anybody loses none of the full force of its existence. An obligation still exists. However, a right that goes unrecognized is not worth very much. Rights only matter if people honor them. It makes nonsense to say that men have, on the one hand, rights and on the other hand, obligations. Such words only express differences in point of view. The actual relationship between the two is as between object and subject. So she thinks that the difference between rights and obligations is all to do with your point of view. And like when we're talking object and subject, this is like about how you phrase a sentence, like it's which way are you looking at it? It's all to do with point of view. A man considered in isolation only has duties, which are amongst which are certain duties towards himself. Other men, seen from his point of view, only have rights. He, in his turn, has rights when seen from the point of view of other men who recognize they have obligations towards him. A man left alone in the universe would have no rights whatever, but he would have obligations. And I think this is a really interesting way to think about it. If we think that it's like two different point of view, like we've got the obligations of like the things you have to other people that you have to do, and rights are what other people have. So in this way, obligations are more important because the obligations are the things that you have to uphold, that you have to other people, whereas rights are just things that other people have or things that you might have, but it doesn't require any action. And the whole idea of that if there was a man alone in the universe, he doesn't have any rights because there's no other people to uphold them, but he would have obligations. So interesting way to think about it. The notion of rights being of an objective order is inseparable from the notions of existence and reality. This becomes apparent when the obligation descends to the realm of fact. Consequently, it always involves to a certain extent, the taking into account of actual given states and particular situations. Rights are always found to be related to certain conditions. Obligations alone remain independent of conditions. They belong to a realm situated above all conditions because it is situated above this world. So I've just got this here coming back. Rights are not as important as obligations because rights are to do with circumstance and obligations are eternal. So rights are always to do with certain conditions, is what she's arguing here. But obligations are independent of certain situations, independent of circumstance. So in that way, obligations are more important than rights because rights are always to do with particular situations. They belong to a realm situated above all conditions because it is situated above this world. Interesting. It starts to feel a little bit religious here, I guess. The men of 1789 did not recognize the existence of such a realm. All they recognized was the one on the human plane. That is why they started off with the idea of rights. But at the same time, they wanted to postulate absolute principles. The contradiction caused them to tumble into a confusion of language and ideas, which is largely responsible for the present political and social confusion. The realm of what is eternal, universal, unconditioned is other than the one conditioned by facts, and different ideas hold sway there, ones which are related to the most secret recesses of the human soul. So she's talking about the problem of the French Revolution. They're wanting to make absolute principles, which causes confusion. Obligations are only binding on human beings. There are no obligations for collectives as such, but they exist for all human beings who constitute, serve, command, or represent a collective, or represent a collectivity in that part of their existence, which is related to the collectivity as in that part which is independent of it. So she thinks obligations are only for individuals, not for groups, except for those who serve groups. So things like the government, they have obligations, but just a random group doesn't have obligations. It's only for individuals, except if you're the government or someone who serves others. All human beings are bound by identical obligations, although these are performed in different ways according to particular circumstances. No human being, whoever he may be, under whatever circumstances, can escape them without being guilty of a crime, save where there are two genuine obligations which are in fact incompatible, and a man is forced to sacrifice one of them. So this is some interesting here. So we are bound to identical obligations. And you can't escape your obligations without having done sort of crime, done something wrong. And the only times that she can see that it would be a case where you aren't doing something wrong by not upholding your obligations is if there are two competing obligations, which would make them incompatible, and you would have to sacrifice one obligation for the other. And we can probably think of quite a few times where you might have to sacrifice obligations, like you might have to sacrifice your obligations to your dog because you have obligations to your wife. There's going to be some times and some crazy circumstances where you have to choose obligations over the other. The imperfections of social order can be measured by the number of situations of this kind it harbors within itself. But even in such a case, a crime is committed if the obligation so sacrificed is not merely sacrificed in fact, but its existence denied into the bargain. So avoiding obligations is committing a crime unless you have two obligations in conflict. And that even in such a case, a crime is committed if you don't do your obligation. If the obligation so sacrificed is not merely sacrificed in fact, but its existence denied into the bargain. The object of any obligation in the realm of human affairs is always the human being as such. There exists an obligation towards every human being for the sole reason that he or she is a human being. So being a human entails obligations. You listening right now have obligations purely because you are a human being. I hope. I hope there's no aliens out there listening to this. There might be. Um, Hopefully not doing VCE, because if you're an alien, surely you have better things to do than VCE. Um, but you are a human being, you have some obligations. Without any other condition requiring to be fulfilled, and even without any recognition of such obligation on the part of the individual concerned. This obligation is not based upon any de facto situation, nor upon jurisprudence, customs, social structure, relative state of forces, historical heritage, or presumed historical orientation, for no de facto situation is able to create an obligation. So she's saying that obligations to other humans are not based on any history or convention. This obligation is not based on any convention, for all conventions are liable to be modified according to the wishes of the contracting parties, whether in this case no change in the mind and will of man can modify anything whatsoever. This obligation is an eternal one. It is coextensive with the eternal destiny of human beings. So extending over the same area is what coextensive means. And this is where we're getting like a little bit, perhaps, a little bit out there. She's saying that obligation seems to be connected to the eternal destiny of human beings. And some of us may believe that there is an eternal destiny of human beings, that there is something that happens to your soul after death. Only human beings have eternal destiny. Human collectives have not got one, nor are there, in regard to the latter, any direct obligations of an eternal nature. Duty towards the human beings as such, that alone is eternal. This obligation is an unconditional one. It is founded on something. That something, whatever it is, does not form part of our world. In our world, it is not founded on anything at all. It is the one and only obligation in connection with human affairs that is not subject to any condition. So, obligation, she thinks, is not founded on something in our world because humans have an eternal destiny. This obligation has no foundation, but only a verification on the common consent accorded by the universal conscience. It finds expression in some of the oldest written texts, for example, the Bible, which have come down to us. It is recognized by everybody without exception in every single case where it is not attacked as a result of interest or passion, and it is in relation to it that we measure our progress. The recognition of this obligation is expressed in a confused and imperfect form that is more or less imperfect according to the particular case by what are called positive rights. And this is something people need to secure their well-being. You need positive rights. To the extent to which positive rights are in contradiction with it, to that precise extent, their origin is an illegitimate one. Although this eternal obligation is coextensive with the eternal destiny of the human being, this destiny is not its direct motive. So the obligations we have are not the direct motive of our obligations. A human being's eternal destiny cannot be the motive of any obligation, for it is not subordinate to external actions. I'll come back to this annotation there. The fact that a human being possesses an eternal destiny imposes only one obligation: respect. The obligation is only performed if the respect is effectively expressed in a real, not fictitious way, and this can only be done through the medium of man's earthly needs. So she's got in this little paragraph here, but the eternal destiny is not what motivates our obligation. It's not the direct motive. It might be like a side motive, but it's not the direct one. The fact that a human being has an eternal destiny, that there is something that happens to our soul after death, imposes only one obligation: respect, which is done through man's earthly needs. So it needs to be done through the earthly needs. On this point, the human conscience has never varied. Thousands of years ago, the Egyptians believed that no soul could justify itself after death unless it could say, I have never let one I have never let anyone suffer from hunger. All Christians know they are liable to hear Christ himself say to them one day, I was and hungered, and ye gave me meat. Everyone looks on progress as being, in the first place, a transition to a state of human society in which people will not suffer from hunger. So here are some earthly needs we're talking about here. Hunger, to no matter whom the question may be put in general terms, nobody is of the opinion that any man is innocent if, possessing food himself in abundance and finding someone on his doorstep 3 parts dead from hunger, he brushes past without giving him anything. And this seems to be that something that all cultures seem to agree on, is that, like, if you have food in abundance, you are doing something wrong if you are not sharing it with the starving person next to you. So all cultures would agree that it is wrong to deny the needs of a human, if it is possible for you to give them their needs. So here is sort of like the hunger analogy that we may refer to. We have an obligation to have or give human needs or earthly needs to other humans if we are on our way to our eternal destiny. So it is an eternal obligation towards the human being not to let him suffer from hunger when one has the chance of coming to his assistance. This obligation being the most obvious of all, it can serve as a model on which to draw up the list of eternal duties towards each human being. In order to be absolutely correctly made out, this list ought to proceed from the example just given by way of analogy. Consequently, the list of obligations towards the human being should correspond to the list of such human needs are vital, analogous to hunger. So this, she says, is the most important part. The most important part that we need to know is that the list of obligations towards a human being should correspond to the list of human needs. So things that are like hunger. That's how we figure out our obligations. And that brings us to the end of the reading. So we have had quite some interesting things on obligations and rights, as well as a connection to our own good life and the good life of the individual. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that this has helped. I'll see you in the next video.